Ezekiel chapter 7 tonight. Last week we saw the final illustration of God's coming judgment. And then we kind of saw Ezekiel's first sermon. He talked about idolatry as a whole. This week he'll preach a sermon explaining again the sins committed and the severity of the judgment. We'll then see Ezekiel's vision of Jerusalem. So there's going to be a little bit more stuff on idolatry and different things that are take place here. But we're going to be in Ezekiel 7. So I'll just start with the outline, I guess. Roman numeral 1, the end has come. So the end has come. And we have pens around if anyone needs them. Right there in that basket. Let's start with, I'm just going to read verses 1 through 4 to get us kind of started. It says, "Then this message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to Israel. The end is here." Now some versions say the four corners of the earth. Wherever you look in the four corners of the earth, your land is finished. Mine says wherever you look, east, west, north, or south, your land is finished. No hope remains. For I will unleash my anger against you. I will call you to account for all your detestable sins. I will turn my eyes away and show no pity. I will repay you for all your detestable sins. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So the message began in the same way that the first one did that he received. The word of the Lord came to me. This time the focus was not on idolatry as in chapter 6, but on the land, which really talking about the people that are living in the land. Ezekiel's message was that the end had come upon the four corners of the land. The word end is used 5 times in the beginning of this sermon, a couple times in verse 2 and then once in 3, and we'll see a couple times in verse 6. The prophet Amos used the word in a similar way to describe the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BC. Here Ezekiel repeats the same message for the southern kingdom, the four corners of the land. Basically, he's indicating that no portion would escape God's judgment. God's judgment was going to be on all the people in the land. He's talking about the southern kingdom here. The events about to unfold on Israel would bring a new revelation of God's character. And it's always good to see as God begins to reveal more of his character to us. This would be the people would realize that God, being righteous, punishes sin. God vowed to unleash his anger against Israel without pity. He would judge her according to her conduct and repay her for her detestable practices. Now these judgments were repeated in verses 3 and 4 again for emphasis. Then Israel would know that God is the Lord. This clause appears again at the end of the sermon. So he's doing these things so that they'll know that he is the one true God. So let's look at a couple things here that are laid out. I'm going to usually I just go right down in order 1 through 4, then 5 through 6 and so forth. But I'm going to jump around a little bit more today. But I wrote out the verses so you'll be fine. So point A, let's look at the sins causing God's judgment. The sins causing God's judgment. Number 1, I just read those verses, idolatry. Idolatry. Ezekiel caused the people to account for their behavior of idolatry. That kind of jumped out to me when I was first reading it. Verse 3 says, God is speaking, I will call you to account for all your detestable sins. And we think about that idolatry, and we'll get into a lot of details when he has his vision of Jerusalem. But it kind of struck me a little bit that I too will have to give an account for all of my behavior. And that kind of just jumped out to me. That's what he's saying to the people of Judah. But he'll one day say that to me as well, that I will give an account for all of my detestable sins. Now, we think my sins aren't as bad as their sins, but as we all know, to God, all of our sins are detestable because of his holiness. And I'll have to give an account one day. And that kind of stopped me for a second, and I just kind of sat there for a minute, and I was like, that's not good. And then I kept reading after that. But sometimes it just makes you pause just for a second that, you know, we sweep so many things under the carpet, or we're good at hiding things, or, you know, rationalizing things away. But one day, I'll give an account to God for my behavior, for my sins, for me missing the mark. The disaster that was facing Israel would be no accident in history. God announced his intentions. He says, I will pour out my wrath on Judah. They would experience the full extent of God's anger. This was not an impulsive or reactionary thing that God's doing. He's declaring, I am going to judge you. And when you read, I will turn my eyes away and show no pity, I will repay you for all your detestable sins. And God shows us a lot of mercy still. I mean, you think about if we were punished exactly how we deserve, I mean, we would have some short lives and painful lives and those sort of things as well. So, but he's going to show no pity to the land, the people of Judah here. God declared that he would judge according to their ways. He would bring on them all their abominations in the land. And he threatened to show no pity or no mercy. So the first sin that he kind of looks at is idolatry. Then we're going to jump down a little bit, and I want to talk about number 2, greed. Number 2, greed. We're going to skip around a little bit. I'm going to jump down to verse 19 there of chapter 7. We'll come back and catch the rest. But they will throw their money in the streets, tossing it out like worthless trash. Their silver and gold won't save them on that day of the Lord's anger. It will neither satisfy nor feed them, for their greed can only trip them up. They were proud of their beautiful jewelry and used it to make detestable idols and vile images. Therefore, I will make all their wealth disgusting to them. I will give it as plunder to foreigners, to the most wicked of nations, and they will defile it. It's kind of interesting here. Greed. The love of money makes them stumble into their sin. In addition to lamenting or mourning their loss, the people would remove the obstacles that had caused it. They would throw their silver into the streets, and their gold would be an unclean thing. You think about this, when they're completely, because we know Babylon's going to surround them. It's going to basically starve them out. There'll be famine and plague, and we've talked about that already. We'll talk about that again tonight. What good is that silver and gold to them? Mm-hmm. They just throw it in the streets. It's not worth anything. And God's saying, it was a detestable thing, because what you did is you took that silver and gold, and many times, remember, the Israelites made a golden calf with all of their jewelry. So they took what should have been silver and gold, and they made idols out of that as well. But their idols made from the metal of the jewelry would be an unclean thing. The word for unclean thing was used of the ceremonial impurity, like touching of a corpse or something like that. It was impure. It pictured the revulsion Israel would feel toward their wealth. They didn't want anything to do with the money. What gave them so much security and quote-unquote happiness, what does it mean now? And we saw that, we saw a picture of that in the New Testament as well with the rich ruler. All that wealth, Lazarus ate off the crumbs, but then he went to heaven to be with the Lord. And the rich man was in hell. What good did all that wealth do him at that point? And God says that they would be punished in such a way that they would loathe their material wealth. One reason was the inability of silver and gold to buy their security. It's really kind of a couple things that happen here. I'm skipping around on my notes a little bit to see. God couldn't be bought off, obviously. You know, one reason they would loathe that wealth was the inability to buy the security. You know, most people that have a lot of money, they don't get worried quite as much when what we would call a devastating thing happens, because it's not devastating for them. They just kind of take care of it. But there's no amount of money that can take care of this. And there's an equalizer. I mean, you see like things like cancer and things like that. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't buy your health and those sort of things. But God cannot be bought off. Another reason for their sudden just loathing of their wealth was the inability of the silver and gold to buy food to satisfy their hunger in the famine. Besides being useless as a means of deliverance, Israel's wealth was also temporary. All they could do, all that they had accumulated would be taken by Babylon one day, be plundered by foreigners. So all of this wealth that probably gave them tremendous security, power, influence, all those things. I mean, the same thing happens to us, will happen to us one day. All that wealth doesn't really matter to God. But even more disconcerting than the loss of wealth was God's pronouncement about the temple. It says, I will turn my face away from them, and they will desecrate my treasured place. Robbers will enter it and desecrate it. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But so the sins causing the judgment was idolatry, and then greed. Verse 23 talks about bloodshed or violence. So bloodshed. Verse 22 says, I will turn away from them as these robbers invade and defile my treasured land. Prepare chains for my people, for the land is bloodied by terrible crimes. Jerusalem is filled with violence. So the land is bloodied by terrible crimes, and violence is rampant throughout the city. Verse 23, we see that chains would be used to carry into captivity the people who were known for bloodshed and violence. God's plans were ready to be implemented. He says, I will bring the most wicked of the nations to take possession of your houses. Now, we know them to be Babylon. If you know anything about Babylon, they were a ruthless and cruel nation. And God had selected them to be the one that would punish them for their sin. So we have idolatry, greed, bloodshed, and then the last one is pride. Number 4, pride. Verse 24 says, I will bring the most ruthless of nations to occupy their homes. I will break down their proud fortresses and defile their sanctuaries. Pride. Israel's haughty pride and religious prostitution would be crushed under Babylon's army. God will break down their proud fortresses. So as I look at these sins, we know the end has come. He is gone. The northern kingdom's already been defeated. They are no more. The southern kingdom will be taken. We know from the illustrations that he's already done that there will be a remnant that will survive. A few hairs, remember, from last week. But then you look at the sins that caused this, and he's talked about this before, but he's kind of speaking it out now, not just illustrating. Idolatry, greed, bloodshed, and pride. And I like to always kind of look at my own life a little bit. I don't do a lot of bloodshed necessarily. I'm not a real violent kind of man. I leave that to like Aaron and other people that like violence a little more than I do. And
Dwayne.
Yeah, Dwayne. Yeah. But idolatry, I've already told you, Ezekiel will have a sermon on idolatry. Idols of the mind. Things that sometimes take priority over the things of God. You look at greed. We try not to be greedy people, but we have to protect against that. But the last one really is pride. That's the one that really sneaks in, because we deserve certain things. Well, why do you deserve that? Well, we're prideful people. We think we deserve it. What do we deserve? We only deserve what God gives us. But we complain that when it's not enough. So as we look at the sins of of Judah here, they're not too far off of some of the things that we could be part of. So we look at the sins causing God's judgment. Point B, let's look at the severity of God's judgment. And we've talked about these things, the severity of God's judgment, so we won't spend a lot of time on them, but I'll read some verses to you. Most of them we're going to go back to verse 5 and take that through most of what we skipped over. So verse 4 ends with, then you will know that I am the Lord. Verse 5, this is what sovereign Lord says. Disaster after disaster is coming your way. The end has come. It has finally arrived. Your final doom is waiting. O people of Israel, the day of your destruction is dawning. The time has come. The day of trouble is near. Shouts of anguish will be heard on the mountains, not shouts of joy. Soon I'll pour out my fury on you and unleash my anger against you. I will call you to account for all your detestable sins. Now, he said that earlier in verse 3. Now he repeats it again. I will turn my eyes away and show no pity. I will repay you for all your detestable sins. Then you will know that it is I, the Lord, who is striking the blow. The day of judgment is here. Your destruction awaits. The people's wickedness and pride have blossomed to full flower. Verse 11, their violence has grown into a rod that will beat them for their wickedness. None of these proud and wicked people will survive. All their wealth and prestige will be swept away. Yes, the time has come. The day is here. Buyers should not rejoice over bargains. I love to rejoice over bargains. Nor sellers grieve over leaving money on the table. For all of them will fall under my terrible anger. Even if the merchants survive, they will never return to their business. For what God has said applies to everyone. It will not be changed. Not one person whose life is twisted by sin will ever recover. So there he talks a little bit about some of the severity. Number one is continuous disaster and calamity. Continuous disaster and calamity. The first verse that we read, this is what the sovereign Lord said. Disaster after disaster is coming your way. So it's one thing after another. There's just going to be terror after terror, disaster after disaster, calamity after calamity, God's judgment after God's judgment. It'll just pour, kind of like this rain is doing, I guess. One after another. Number two, verses 7 through 14, which we just read those. God's punishment without his pity. God's punishment without his pity. So we covered a little bit of this. He'll neither spare nor pity them. God's judgment would have economic consequences. When it struck, none of the people would be left. Nothing of value would remain. So if they were a booming city financially, once they're starved out and plague hits, none of that, there would be no value that would remain. Because of the captivity, property and material possessions were worthless. So the beautiful house they once had, they will be kicked out of. It'll be destroyed or somebody else will occupy it. Ezekiel exhorted, let not the buyer rejoice nor the seller grieve. The buyer who normally rejoiced over a good business deal should not be happy because he would not be able to possess the land he had just purchased anyway. The one forced to sell his land should not grieve because he would have lost it anyway. So he's just kind of letting them know when it's going. When land was sold in Israel, the transaction was always temporary. Every 50 years, during the year of Jubilee, the property reverted to its original owners. However, God's coming judgment would prevent original owners from reclaiming their properties. They would be in exile along with the buyers. So no human effort could hinder God from accomplishing his plan. Though they would call soldiers to battle, there would be no one to go into battle for them. Jerusalem would try to defend itself, but they would fall with little resistance. So we'll see that as we go deeper into the book of Ezekiel. But the severity of God's judgment, he's saying, listen, there's going to be continuous disaster and calamity, one after another. God's punishment is without his mercy, without his pity. And the last one is number 3, and we've kind of hit on it already. Verses 15 through 18, death by plagues inside the city, death by sword outside the city. He's already said that in previous chapters, but death by plagues to the people inside the city, death by sword outside the city. Verse 15, there's a war outside the city and disease and famine within. Those outside the city's walls will be killed by enemy swords. Those inside the city will die of famine and disease. The survivors who escape to the mountains will moan like doves, weeping for their sins. Their hands will hang limp. Their knees will be weak as water. They will dress themselves in burlap. Horror and shame will cover them. They will shave their heads in sorrow and remorse. So we saw that last week he shaved his head in sorrow and remorse, and they'll do the same thing. Now we've studied this already. I mean, he illustrated this when he took the big brick and drew Jerusalem on it, and they were surrounded and so forth. Nothing can come in, nothing can go out. They are going to be starved to death. And with starvation comes different disease and plagues and things like that. Those that tried to escape or were survived after they penetrated, they would be killed by the sword. And then he does say some will escape to the mountains, but they're going to be miserable people. So this is kind of what he's talking about here. We've hit this before. Israel's response to God's onslaught is pictured here. Hands go limp, knees would become as weak as water. The few who would survive will moan for their sins. They will moan over that, mourn over it. So I haven't heard the terminology weak as water before, but I'm guessing in water we're kind of just the buoyancy.
I was looking at, I'm using the enduring word, and it talks about weak as water, and back in the day meant the loss of their bladder, control of their bladder. So like they were so freaked out or scared or whatever that they lose control of their bladder.
That sounds great, doesn't it?
I thought I get that as I read this.
Every leg
Guess you
will
wouldn't have to get
be
up
wet
and let
with
it
urine.
alone.
That's what mine says.
Every leg will be wet with urine. So there it goes. It explains that, doesn't it?
Wow. Theologians down here at the end.
I know they've got. He's got so many things. I mean, we're cooking with human dung or animal dung, and now we have every leg will be wet with urine. So there we have it.
Wow. Picture's been painted.
All right, so on the back, we see Roman number 2, idolatry in the temple. Idolatry in the temple. Ezekiel had repeatedly stated that the coming judgment was prompted by people's sins. But what the people of Jerusalem done to deserve severe punishment. So remember, Ezekiel's in captivity. He's not in Jerusalem. Jeremiah is still in Jerusalem prophesying and teaching those people. So here, God is going to show them what's going on in Jerusalem through a vision. So Ezekiel had received a vision of God. Remember, in chapters 1 through 3, he had acted out 4 signs of coming judgment. We saw that in chapters 4 and 5. And then he's given 2 messages of judgment, chapter 6 and chapter 7. So now God gives him a new vision. Now, the vision recorded here starts in chapter 8 and goes through chapter 11. It's really a single unit, yet there's 4 specific sections within it. Ezekiel was first confronted with the wickedness of the people in the temple. That's chapter 8. That's what we're going to look at tonight. Then in chapter 9, he was shown the slaughter of the people of Jerusalem. Chapter 10, Jerusalem was so wicked that God's glory departed from the temple. Remember, even before the temple was built, they had the tabernacle, and the glory, the presence of God was in the tabernacle. So all of the Jews, the presence of God was in the temple. Chapter 10 is going to show that God's glory is departed from the temple. In chapter 11, judgment was pronounced on their rulers. So tonight we'll see the wickedness that was in the temple in chapter 8. So idolatry in the temple. You know, you think about idolatry, you know, in your home, or they went to the high places before they were all destroyed. They'd go there but then you think about it in God's temple, idolatry being in there. So let's look at point A kind of as an introduction to it. His vision of Jerusalem. His vision of Jerusalem. This vision occurred in the 6th year of Jehoiakim's exile. So it was the 6th month on the 5th day. So some of your study Bibles will say, mine says September 17th, 952 BC. This was exactly 14 months after Ezekiel's first vision in chapter 1. So Ezekiel recited in detail the circumstances of his vision that he saw. He was, and we'll read it in just a second, but he was sitting in his house. Elders from among the captives were sitting before him as students. On one particular day, the hand of the Lord God, or the power of God, fell on Ezekiel. Immediately he saw in his prophetic trance a fiery, glowing, man-like figure. No doubt that was the same one that they saw in the throne chariot. That vision, remember? From, what was it, the waist up? It was waist down. It was a fiery glow, and above that was just a glow. You couldn't. It looked like it was the shape of a man, but it couldn't, because the Bible says no one can see God and live. So it's a little bit different there. It's just a shape of man. This, they call it theophany. This was again another one of the figure stretched forth the form of a hand and took hold of the prophet by the lock of his hair in his vision. So he took him a little, didn't drag him, but he took a little lock of his hair and he transported him to Jerusalem in his vision. So that's what we're going to kind of look at. So let's look at 1 through 4 that kind of talks about when the vision took place. My version says, then on September 17th. Yours might say the 5th day of the 6th month. Mm-hmm. During the 6th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, while the leaders of Judah were in my home, the sovereign Lord took hold of me. I saw a figure that appeared to be a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he looked like a burning flame. From the waist up, he looked like gleaming amber. He reached out what seemed to be a hand and took me by the hair. Then the Spirit lifted me up into the sky and transported me to Jerusalem in a vision from God. I was taken to the north gate of the inner courtyard of the temple, where there is a large idol that has made the Lord very jealous. Suddenly the glory of the God of Israel was there, just as I had seen it before in the valley. So 1 through 4 kind of explains what happened. He's there teaching some of the leaders that were in captivity there, some of the elders. So he was teaching them, and God just kind of came upon him, transported him through a vision. His body was still there, but obviously through a vision, he was transported to Jerusalem. So we're going to look at verses 5 through 18. We won't read it all at once. We'll read a little bit at a time. But point B, God reveals the idolatry going on in Judah. So he's in captivity. He's going to be able to see what's going on in Judah, in Jerusalem. And God reveals idolatry going on in Judah. 4 different locations in and around the temple Ezekiel witnessed. Remember, these were called abominable practices. That many of the leaders of Jerusalem were being part of. So the first one that we'll look at, number 1, a large idol at the temple's entrance. A large idol at the temple's entrance. Verse 5 says, then the Lord said to me, Son of man, look toward the north. So I looked, and there to the north, beside the entrance to the gate, near the altar, stood the idol that had made the Lord so jealous. Son of man, he said, do you see what they are doing? Do you see the detestable sins the people of Israel are committing to drive me from my temple? But come and you will see even more detestable sins than these. So it kind of gets us started here. First, God directs his attention to the area north of the altar gate. There he saw a new image of jealousy in the entrance. The image isn't identified, but most likely it was a representation of the fertility goddess Asherah. Those approaching the altar of God passed beside this image. An abomination like this was sufficient to justify God's departure from his sanctuary. Asherah, remember, they tore down the poles of Asherah, and it was a big false idol at that time. As Ezekiel stared at this idol, beside him was the glory of God of Israel. Just like when he saw the glory of God in the valley, God's moral outrage was expressed in his rhetorical question to Ezekiel. Do you see what they are doing? Detestable things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. God will not share his glory with an idol. If the idol inhabited the temple, God would leave. The shock of seeing an idol in the Lord's house must have unnerved Ezekiel a little bit. Yet this was not all Israel had done to provoke the Lord. Ezekiel would see things even more detestable. So if we stop just for a second and kind of think about that thought process that God will not share his glory with an idol. That's when it can it can apply to our lives today. When we have an idol of the heart, when we allow something to take precedence over God, is God going to be glorified or am I going to be glorified? Because we both can't be glorified.
Right.
That idol and God don't both get the glory. God doesn't share his glory with idols. And obviously the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, what we say and do and allow in and so forth. This all plays a role in our own lives as we stop and think about our own lives and our own sins and the detestable things that we allow to be in the temple of the Holy Spirit. It's interesting just to think about. We can come back and talk about that as we finish up things today. But the first place he was taken to was just north of the altar gate in the temple's entrance. Next, number 2, inside the temple. Inside the temple. Next, the Lord brought Ezekiel to the entrance of the inner temple court. Then he saw a hole in the wall of the temple. He was told in the vision to dig through the hole. When he did, he found an entrance to a secret chamber. Entering that door, Ezekiel saw idolatrous carvings on the wall. And we'll read that in just a second. That's verses, we'll pick back up in verse 7 through 14. Let's look at verse 7. So this kind of explains just kind of what I said. Then he brought me to the door of the temple courtyard, where I could see a hole in the wall. He said to me, "Now, son of man, dig into the wall." So I dug into the wall and found a hidden doorway. "Go in," he said, "and see the wicked and detestable sins they're committing in there." So I went in and saw the walls engraved with all kinds of crawling animals and detestable creatures. I also saw the various idols worshipped by the people of Israel. Verse 11, 70 leaders of Israel were standing there, and one of them was, he recognized, that was, Josiah, son of Shaphan. And he was kind of in the center. So it was a relative. He was a little surprised to see him because that whole family had always stayed faithful to God, but here's one that is not. Each of them held an incense burner from which a cloud of incense rose above their heads. Then the Lord said to me, "Son of man, have you seen what the leaders of Israel are doing with their idols in dark rooms? They are saying, 'The Lord doesn't see us. He has deserted our land.'" Then the Lord added, "Come, I will show you even more detestable sins than these." So it's interesting. First, they're outside of the temple by the northern gate. There's this big idol, and people are worshiping and going by it and so forth. Then he says, "Let me show you a hidden place where Israel's leaders are worshiping." So that's what he does. It says the wall had all these carvings of creeping things and beasts. Idols were all in the house of Israel. The fact that these carvings consisted of animals suggests some Egyptian animal cult. Perhaps the religion was adopted by the national leaders during the reign of Jehoiakim, who was a vassal of Pharaoh. So Ezekiel saw standing before these carvings 70 elders of the house of Israel, offering incense of worship before the representations on these temple walls. So these seven, among the 70, these were leaders. And like I said, this Jazana, or however you say that, it comes from a very godly family. But the elders not only practiced a religion collectively in darkness, which means in secret, each also worshiped their own individual chamber as well. They justified their actions to themselves. They had two arguments. The Lord doesn't see us. That one sounds familiar, doesn't it? There are sins that I commit that nobody knows about but me. Because God doesn't see me, right? Mm-hmm. So I do it in darkness. I do it in hiding. Mm-hmm. That's their thought process. Mm-hmm. And the second one is the Lord has forsaken the land, so we're going to find another God. The first argument was blasphemous because it questioned the omniscience of God. The second was really a hypocritical argument because these same leaders were publicly arguing that God would never abandon Jerusalem and the temple. Yet in spite of the audacity of the Egyptian animal cult worship in the temple here, Ezekiel was assured that he would see even greater abominations still. The people's progression of idolatry went from open display of idols to secret worship of idols under the very shadow of God Almighty. Yet this was not the full extent of Israel's wickedness, for they were doing things even more detestable. So we're only halfway into the four-stop vision here in chapter 8. So let's look at verses 13 through 15. He's going to look at number 3, the north gate of the temple. The north gate of the temple. Verse 13. Then the Lord added, "Come, I will show you even more detestable sins than these." He brought me to the north gate at the Lord's temple, and some women were sitting there weeping for the god Tammuz. Have you seen this? He asked. But I will show you even more detestable things than these. I like when God says, do you see this? Do you see what they're doing? But yet there's even worse things going on. So the north gate. So the Lord brought Ezekiel out to the entrance to the north gate of the temple. This was probably the entrance to the temple's outer court. Beside this gate, Ezekiel saw women mourning for their Tammuz. Now, Tammuz is the Hebrew form of the name of the god Dumazai. He was the deity of spring vegetation. So the apparent death of all vegetation, in the Middle East during the hot summer months, would explain in mythology Tammuz's death and ascended to the underworld. But during this time, the followers would weep, mourning his death. So then in the spring, he would emerge victorious and he'd bring forth the life-giving rains. So obviously, he must be dead in the summer. It's so hot. But if we weep for him and mourn for him and pray for him to return, he'll return in the spring and give us all the rain that we need so that we can grow our vegetations and our plants. The worship of Tammuz also involved fertility rites. Worship of the true giver of rain had been replaced with a pagan deity. The worship of the Creator was replaced by the worship of the cycles of creation that he had established. I don't know. We live in Indiana, so I don't know how the cycles of weather the seasons are supposed to go. We're in February with heavy rain and 60 degrees tomorrow. I don't know if that's typical for February, but we are in Indiana, right?
Yeah,
So,
it used to be.
but there's usually there's reasons why you plant in the spring and you harvest in the fall. I mean, there's reasons for this. You heat for the growth, the rain to get it going, and so forth. And here, they're not worshiping the Creator that set this all into motion so that people could make a living and eat and provide for their family and sell stuff off and whatever they needed to do. They were worshiping a deity that thought they would provide the rains. So this is what's happening at the north gate. And then the last one, verses 16 through 18, we see the inner courtyard of the temple. The inner courtyard of the temple. Finally, the Lord brought Ezekiel to the inner court of the temple, really kind of between the porch of the temple and the brazen altar of sacrifice. And we'll see that Ezekiel notices some more leaders here. So verse 16. Then he brought me into the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple at the entrance to the sanctuary between the entry room and the brazen altar. There were about 25 men with their backs to the sanctuary of the Lord. They were facing east, bowing low to the ground, worshiping the sun. Verse 17, he says, "Have you seen this, Son of Man?" he asked. "Is it nothing to the people of Judah that they commit these detestable sins, leading the whole nation into violence, thumbing their noses at me and provoking my anger?" Or some say, putting the branch to their nose or the twig to their nose. "Therefore I will respond in fury. I will neither pity nor spare them. Though they cry for mercy, I will not listen." So, based on the location, he sees 25 men in there. Based on their location, these more than likely were priests. Because of where they were in the inner court. Not everyone could go in there. So these were probably 25 priests. These priests should have been acting as Israel's mediators, crying to God for mercy. But instead, they were bowing down to the sun in the east. The entrance to God's temple, and this is kind of interesting to think about, the entrance to God's temple faced the east. So when a person stood at the altar and faced the entrance, he was looking west. So to look into, he would face west to see the altar. And the priest would face west when they were making their prayers and incense and all that stuff to God. The priests here are facing east. They had turned their backs on God, were bowing in submission and worship to the sun. This is really quite a visual. I mean, these are men of God. I mean, Ezekiel was a priest. He should have started his priesthood at 30. Instead, God says, I want you to be a prophet for me to the people that are in captivity. So that's what's taken. But these are men that were raised a particular way, learned some things. They should be spiritual leaders for Israel. And the visual here is that they have turned their back on God and his temple. And they're bowing, they're surrendering. Because what did Ezekiel do every time he saw God? The image of God, the likeness of God, he fell on his face. That's what these guys are doing to the Son, or the Son God. It's interesting to think a lot of us have grown up in the church. Most of you that are here on Wednesday nights know enough that you know what you should be doing and shouldn't be doing. Because most people don't just come to Wednesday nights because it was fun. They come because they want more, which means they have more already. But this whole thing is a little bit fascinating to me because the role of idols in our lives, and we're paying attention to them, we're really turning our back on the things that we know we should be doing, the things that would honor and please God, that would glorify God. We turn our backs to him as we're given priority to the things of this world, or the idols of our hearts. And these are spiritual leaders, so that would include us that are here tonight. We're spiritual leaders of this particular church, and we can easily turn our backs on God as well. So the horrors Ezekiel had seen in the temple of God were disturbing, but the evil was not confined there. The wickedness being practiced in the temple by the priest and the people had spread throughout the nation. In the last verse there said that anger and violence filled the nation, and that continually provoked God to anger. The people were even putting the branch to the nose, or the twig to the nose. My version says they were thumbing their noses at me. Speaking of God. Now, it's interesting here. This is kind of gives us a picture here. Early Jewish commentators translated branch as stench. Some scholars feel that when they're doing that it kind of represents a putrid, offensive smell to God. Now, we can't be dogmatic on the interpretation of what that necessarily means, but in general sense, it's pretty clear. The gesture was not a compliment to God. They're saying, I know what you're... I mean, we don't do that now, but, maybe back in the day you would go, like this or something.
My dad used to do that to me.
Yeah.
All of us.
They're like, we don't care what you say, I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's an illustration of. Some would put the branch to their nose, thumb their nose to God. I'm going to do what I want to do, regardless of what it means. And that idolatry is a offensive smell to God. God's response was decisive. I will deal with them in anger and not with pity. God would not allow such open rebellion to continue. Even a last-minute, desperate effort on their part to get God to hear their cries would do no good. The stage was set for judgment. It's interesting because Ezekiel's not in Jerusalem at this time, but God transports him there in a vision to see what's going on in Israel, in Jerusalem, really in the temple area, with the people that are going by the temple. They could look outside for the Ashereth god. Then he takes them to a secret place where 70 spiritual leaders are in secret worshiping God. Then he takes them to another place and he sees that. And then finally ends with right there in the courtyard where everybody can see, here's 25 priests that have turned their back to God, on God, to do their own thing, to worship their own idols, to give their allegiance and surrender to a God other than God. So he finishes, he wants them to know that they will know that he is God. And kind of thoughts or additions through your study that you've done, or any applications, anything that jumped out that kind of would be a good reminder for us to kind of hold on to today that we've read through 7 and 8? It's the vision will continue, and we'll get into that next week some. But anybody have any thoughts or comments of what we looked at tonight?
I thought it was interesting, chapter 7, verse 4, where it says, "I will turn my eyes away and show no pity."
Mm-hmm.
That's what he did. He didn't show no pity, but when Jesus died on the cross for us,
Right.
and as he took all our sins upon himself, God had to turn his eyes away because he couldn't bear to look at him.
And we know that just with Jesus, that was a temporary thing. And we know with
Sure.
Judah, it's a temporary thing as well, because there is a remnant. And we know, and we'll see at the end of the book of Ezekiel here, and at the end of the book of the Bible, Revelation, we'll see that that remnant will then once again become the focus of Jesus' reign and so forth. But it's kind of interesting here. It's almost like he's got to completely wipe us out. I mean, that's what the military used to be. I was not part of the military, thankfully, but I'm thankful for those that were. But that's part. They want to break you down and then build you up. And God is destroying the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, save a remnant that will one day be built back up. But that's a great observation there. Anyone else have any thoughts or anything of what we kind of looked at tonight?
When did we go over the idols? Did you say that? Coming up? Or like, you said the more like the idols of.
I
The
think
reason
it.
I say that is because I'm sitting here thinking, is you're like, I've never thought of myself as an idol worshiper.
Thought about that today when I was.
And I'm like, yeah, this is not me. Tell me what you need to, Conrad, but this is not me. But then you say other things, and I'm like,
Yeah, it's somewhere in the 40s. I'll have to look it up.
yeah.
I know when I told you guys that before, when I was a youth pastor, I used to like to preach from the Old Testament. So I did Ezekiel, Idols of the Heart. And it's like chapter 42 or 44 or 46 or something like that. Somewhere through there. And it kind of just, I mean, we always think of idols, you know, the little Buddha that we see in, yes, when I sit back, they can't see me. Sorry about that. You know, we always think of the little Buddha or even the little crosses. It could be idols for some. But an idol really is anything that takes priority over God in our lives. It could be our kids. It could be our spouses.
Vehicles.
It could be work, possessions.
And the thought of, then when I'm making that my priority, then I'm turning my back to God. Like, to me, that's like a,
Well, and that priority is over God,
ugh,
then yeah.
yeah.
I mean, obviously your family will have some priority in your life.
Sure.
But we all know people, and maybe we've been those people at some point, that the absolute most important thing in the entire world are their kids. It's not God. It's their kids. That's an idol.
And then they get older.
You want to be in there.
Yeah,
And then they push you away.
yeah.
You exalted them, they're like, nope, I don't want anything to do with you. I just need your checkbook. I
Yeah.
just need some cash.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. We'll take closer looks at that. And that's a great time for us to examine where we're at, because it's very easy to get our priorities out of whack if we're not careful.
Yeah.
It can happen. Any other thoughts or comments of what we've talked about tonight?
As far as some of the idols go, several years ago here, I skipped a Sunday to go over west of here to a shooting range with a bunch of other guys. Two of the rifles I took with me broke that day. So those idols they didn't get totally destroyed, but they weren't usable for quite a while. So I've never been over there again.
Isn't that fun?
Especially on Sunday.
That might be an object lesson that God gave you there. Steph's dad, when he farmed, and when he was younger, and you know how farmers are. Everything's about the farm. So he would try to work on Sunday. Amy laughs like, "Oh yeah, I've been married in a farming family." He would work some on Sundays, but many Sundays that he worked, something would break down. Until he finally said, "Okay, God, you've knocked me over the head enough times. That's your day." that's a day of rest. If I can't farm in 6 days, I can't farm. And he made that a priority for the rest of the other 50 years that he
And he
farmed.
still got done on time, didn't
Yep.
Somehow, he's still got everything done. And that's how God provides. And Pastor Jason just talked about the importance of rest in our
Right.
lives. And I was reading through the Psalms today, and one of them talks about rest, and I was like, okay. You know, yeah, God sometimes will say, I can get your attention in the still small voice, or guns breaking, combines breaking down. I can get your attention. I'd like to think that I could get to the point where I can hear the still small voice,
Right.
because that's going to be less painful to listen to what I'm supposed to be doing than if he really needs to get my attention. So it's kind of interesting. But any other thoughts or comments?
I remember when Jericho had passed, and I went deeper than I ever wanted to go, not in God. And God gave me Jeremiah 2:9, and this fits with Ezekiel. Consider then and realize how evil and bitter it is for you when you forsake the Lord your God and have no awe of me, declares the Lord Almighty. Evidently, they had forsaken him, and they had no awe of God at all. At all.
Because we know the awe or the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what these people are doing. God can't see me
Right.
in this secret place, and he's deserted me anyway.
Right.
How many times do we see people going down a road of sin, and they get to a point where, like, well, what does it matter now?
Yeah.
I'll just give up everything. And they continue to do more sins until they come to their senses, like the prodigal son did.
Yeah.
And I saw that before. As a youth pastor, I had a gal that was kind of drugged up and taken advantage of by somebody other than her boyfriend. And her boyfriend had been pressuring her sexually. She's like, well, what's it matter now? I think it matters a lot still.
Yeah.
But yeah, those things can happen. So yeah, I mean, they weren't in awe of God. They turned their back on him. And there'll be some similarities with Jeremiah as well. You're right. Anyone else before we've got a little bit of time, we can take some prayer requests and things. Go ahead, Mary Jane.
Well, I was just gonna say, I have done better reading my Bible and studying since I've had my heart thing done. And I think, I wish people would do it before they have, well, I can't do this, and I can't do that, so I might as well read the Bible. I don't feel that way now. I think when I started, I probably did. I mean, I've read it through before a long time ago.
Sure.
And various parts of it, but to really get into it. And I think, gee, don't wait till you're 80. Start when you're 20, you know?
Until something terrible has happened in your
Yeah.
life, or
Right.
relationships,
Yes,
or,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
like Conrad says, that your kids just don't listen to you, and you want so badly for them to
right.
Right.
learn from my mistakes. You don't have, what does you always say? You don't have to
You don't have to do make every mistake yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
learn from other people's
Learn from
right?
others,
Like, that's
yeah.
what you want more than anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Claire, this is a prayer request. Claire and her friend Morgan, Morgan practically lives with us, which is fine. We like her really well. But they are going to Faith Quest. So pray that they will really take it seriously.
That's coming up really quickly, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's the last weekend of March, I
Okay.
think, yeah. But we're really excited, and we just, and, you know, and.
Now,
it
Claire
is
went
gonna
several
be-
years ago, right?